Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky recently gave the strongest confirmation that the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive has begun to repel the Russian army. Following this confirmation, clashes around the city of Bakhmut increased significantly. Battles are still raging for supply lines in Kremova, northwest of the city. When we look at the Willard trenches of Ivanovskaya, southwest of Bakhmut, we can see that the situation is not different. And heavy clashes took place between both sides of the war here. Ukrainians seem to be on the offensive in other settlements of Donetsk and Chusovaya, Bodanivka, Dubova, Vasilivka, and Kaliska. The Ukrainian army seems to have taken control slowly, usually with artillery and HIMARS attacks. But Zelensky had given his confirmation that the Ukrainian army had officially started major offensive attacks. Not for the Donetsk front lines, but for a front line that even the Russian forces did not expect in a large offensive corridor stretching towards the southwest side of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainian armed forces began to take effect in Volodya Pola and now finally in the city of Orikhiv of the Zaporizhia region. The Ukrainian army carried out an offensive operation in the city that will go down in the history of world wars. Currently, clashes have been going on for about a week in the Zaporizhia region. But for the first time in a long time, the southern flanks of the region began to be this active. Recently, the Ukrainians sent their special forces to the southern flanks of the Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian special forces conducted an incredible offensive operation against the Russians here. Russian media reported that Ukraine launched a massive tank attack in the direction of Zaporizhia, and there were many seriously wounded soldiers on the battlefield. Soldiers from the 65th Mechanized Brigade, 23rd Public Protection Brigade, 15th Operation Brigade, Kharkiv National Guard, 110th Defense Brigade, and 102nd Defense Brigade took part in this offensive operation. These special forces first broke through the first Russian border line in Orikhiv. Then the 5 special Ukrainian forces dispersed to the east and west of Orikhiv from 2 branches and began to advance in these areas. Dozens of tanks and armored infantry vehicles belonging to the Ukrainian Special Forces also supported this historic offensive operation. The guards of the 15th Operation Brigade, Kharkiv National Guard, the 65th Mechanized Brigade, and the 23rd Public Protection Brigade broke through the Russian trench in the fence line from the west of Orikhiv to Vasilivka, where they made serious progress. On the other hand, the soldiers of the 110th Defense Brigade and the 102nd Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian Army advanced from the eastern flanks of Orikhiv to Polahi. The distances between Orikhiv and Polohi and between Orikhiv and Vasilivka are equal. The Russian trenches retreated in these areas by a total of about 10 kilometers. In other words, the Ukrainians divided their special forces into 2 branches from such a strategic location that both special units traveled almost the same distance and managed to disperse the Russian trenches in the east and west directions of Orikhiv. This mind-blowing war tactic was one of the most effective methods used by the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia region to date. Therefore, the Russian troops had to retreat from the front lines of Vasilivka and Polohi, where the Ukrainian special forces attacked in order not to inflict too many casualties, and Russian forces failed to register any retaliatory attacks in either area. Because the Ukrainian army has deployed its 5 special units in a way that will completely blockade both Vasilivka and Polohi. Here, the search and reconnaissance operations of the Ukrainians still continue. The aim is to destroy the remaining Russian troops and continue the advance. Russian sources also admit that the Ukrainian army has begun a counterattack. Even Russian mill bloggers stated that the focus of Ukraine's long-awaited counterattack would be Zaporizhia. Finally, the Ukrainians showed that the offensive operations will now take Zaporizhia under their influence by putting their 5 special forces on the field. So Russian mill bloggers and Moscow-supporting media sources were right about this. The stunning success of the Ukrainian army was also supported by the published footage of the clashes near Orikhiv. The latest geolocation footage proved that Ukrainian forces in western Zaporizhia Oblast made local gains during counterattacks southwest and southeast of Orikhiv. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces are trying to regain access to the Sea of Azov by dividing the Russian forces in the region into 2 separate groups. This would not only weaken Russia's combat capability but also destroy and bridge to the southern peninsula of Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. In fact, liberating the Crimean Peninsula is the main purpose of the Ukrainians to divide Kyiv and the Zaporizhia region into two and carry out simultaneous offensive operations from both branches. For Ukrainians, the key to the war is Crimea. The Russians also wanted to protect this peninsula at all costs. In fact, the Crimean Peninsula is described as the red line of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Surprisingly, Ukrainians have come a long way to reach this peninsula these days. But right now, there is a huge crisis in the region on the connecting corridor reaching Crimea. This crisis, of course, is the collapse of the Novokakhovka Dam. As you all know, the Kakhovka Dam collapsed in the Russian-occupied territory in southern Ukraine, resulting in a flood of water downstream. So who benefits from the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam in the event of a violation of the Kakhovka Dam? Russia can point to at least two ways that will harm its own interests. The flooding of the land downstream forced Russian soldiers and civilians to evacuate to the east, away from Kherson and the wide banks of the Dnipro River. This will provide limited rest for the inhabitants of Kherson, who have to live with daily Russian artillery and missile attacks. Secondly, this could affect the water supply of Russian-occupied Crimea, an arid peninsula that relies on fresh water from a channel near the breached dam. Whoever crosses the Kakhovka barrage will have upset the strategic chessboard in southern Ukraine, forcing both sides to make a series of major adjustments and possibly delaying Ukraine's next move in the long-promised counterattack. But the crossing of the Kakhovka Dam must be seen in the broader context of the Ukrainian war, and more specifically, in the light of the summer counteroffensive, which signals that Ukraine has already begun for this counterattack to be successful. Russia must break its hold on a piece of land it seized last year that connects Crimea to the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. If Ukraine can find a way to break through the Russian defensive line south of Zaporizhia and divide this region in two, then it can isolate Crimea and achieve a major strategic victory. But the Russians have learned many lessons since their massive invasion in February last year. Putin's troops have now looked at the map and identified where Ukraine is most likely to attack. And they have spent the last few months building some really tough fortification lines to block Ukraine's advance into the Sea of Azov. In response to these security measures of the Russians, of course, the Ukrainian army did not stay idle and supplied Storm Shadow long-range missiles from the United Kingdom. The Storm Shadow cruise missile has a range of over 150 miles. This effective range is 3 times the range of the missiles Ukraine has used so far. The range of the Storm Shadow missiles makes it easy for Ukraine to launch precision strikes against previously inaccessible, high-value Russian targets. In other words, the Ukrainian army can target Crimea with these missiles. In addition, the Army of Unmanned Aerial Vehicles of the Armed Forces of Ukraine is constantly conducting attacks on the Crimean Peninsula. Actually, everything seems ready for Ukraine. Perhaps the Ukrainian attacks on the flanks of the city of Orakov in the Zaporizhia region were only a rehearsal for the main offensive. Fortress city Bakhmut offers slices of hell for Russian forces. Bakhmut has no strategic value. However, this city becomes the focal point of symbolic conflict between the two countries. Ukrainian troops are becoming gigantic in the city of Bakhmut, which hosts the most violent clashes of Eastern Front line. New news is coming from the small city where breathtaking struggles are experienced and the tension does not decrease for a minute. Zelensky stated that he and his military leaders will maintain their presence in Bakhmut despite the ongoing Russian aggression in the city. Zelensky also stated that he plans to keep the city. Ukrainian forces are confronted by both the regular Russian army and the Wagner Special Military Group, with prisoners filling their trenches in droves. There are intense conflicts between the two. Wagner forces are using much larger offensive units as their deadline to capture Bakhmut is up. The Wagner paramilitary group is trying to eliminate the Ukrainians and seize new positions. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, be crushing the Russians in Bakhmut with tanks and artillery units. Kiev troops begin to destroy the main Russian positions by making pinpoint attacks. At the same time, the Ukrainians use aerial bombs and guided missiles, causing great damage to Russian logistics. Unable to escape the Ukrainian attacks, the Russians are cornered in the small 41-kilometer city. The previous day, Ukrainian troops destroyed 6 buildings used as fortifications by the Wagner Group with successful artillery fire. As a result of the Wagner fortifications falling to the ground, casualties were, of course, inevitable. The Russians lost their lives in the violin trade. The Russian army had to assemble several teams using wheelbarrows to collect the bodies of their soldiers. The most recent reports shows that these attacks are just the beginning in the combat footage released by the Russian Defense Ministry. It is seen that the Russians are targeting the Ukrainian positions from afar by using high-rise buildings. When the Russian forces want to hit 10-story buildings, they don't even need to go up to the roof to aim directly. For this reason, the main target of Ukrainians is high-rise buildings on Luhansk Street, because the Russians could target the entire west side of the city from here. In the combat footage released by the Ukrainian armed forces, it is seen that they attacked one of the high-rise buildings very violently. Looking at the explosion, we can think that the Kiev troops used an HIMARS system in this attack. Another video showed the Ukrainian troops destroying the second high-rise building just across the street with a controlled explosion in this building was causing problems for the Ukrainians because it was used by Russian snipers. As we have seen before in violent residential conflicts, the front line can do a great deal of back and forth even in one day. Ukrainians apparently launched a counterattack in this area. The Ukrainians took back the area and planted explosives. The timing was perfect as the operation coincided with the exact moment when the Russians were regrouping. Thanks to this perfect timing, the Kiev forces were able to make great progress. After the successful operation, the Ukrainian forces achieved a much better result than they could get from HIMARS attack. Many changes took place in the center of the region as well. Many reports claimed that Ukrainian forces left the engineering and medical schools and were stationed in the high-rise buildings in the rear. Some analysts argue that the aim was to get closer to the main line of defense, while others argue that this was forced due to the Russian advance in the south. It seems that the first explanation is more appropriate because the current combat footage shows that the Russian forces are still not able to establish a tight control in this area. The main purpose of the Russian troops here was to divide the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut in two. But despite the Russian capture of the industrial faculty, Ukrainian soldiers still move freely between these two parts of the city. The reason for this is local geography. Since the area behind the houses is lower, it is not possible to open fire directly from this area. Current combat footage showed Ukrainian forces making an unexpected raid on Russian positions and attacking from two different directions with two tanks opening devastating fire. After the influx, drone operators reached Kharkiv. Russian troops were navigating the area with wheelbarrows, collecting the corpses of their dead soldiers. When the drone detected new movements in the area, Ukrainian troops targeted the concentrated areas behind the Faculty of Industry, doubling the damage. Ukrainian troops collected the spoils of war after counterattacks. Images of the Ukrainian soldiers disinfecting the weapons seized from the Wagner Group were shared on some social media platforms. Ukrainian soldiers also shared images of another war loot, a thermobaric artillery system used in the Bakhmut sector. Wagner Group head Prigozhin Wagner claimed that his forces had advanced as much as 250 meters in some areas. Prigozhin stated that this limited progress has caused great losses. According to Wagner's boss, the paramilitary group lost 99 soldiers during one day. Offensive action. Considering the artillery attacks and tank raids on Russian positions, we think that these casualties are higher. Also, at the end of the day, Ukraine reported that its pilots had launched 4 attacks on areas where enemy personnel were concentrated. Kiev announced that rocket and artillery fire hit 5 areas where weapons and military equipment were concentrated, as well as an ammunition depot and a logistics center. On the other hand, in recent interview, Prigozhin announced that if the Russian Ministry of Defense does not support Wagner, the Wagner soldiers will either stay and die completely or leave Bakhmut completely. Russian forces still suffer from manpower shortages due to casualties to recruit more soldiers. The Russian Ministry of Defense has launched a massive new recruiting campaign for volunteers. The goal of the campaign is to attract 400,000 volunteers across the country, target the masculine pride and financial needs of young Russians to attract volunteers to the Russian armed forces. But the Russian military is competing with the private military company of the Wagner Group. Prigozhin's mercenary group plays an important supporting role in the Kremlin's special military operation. With the permission of the Russian government, the Wagner Group has recruited massively out of Russian prisons for months. But now that the arrangement is over and the Wagner Group and the Russian army are competing for the same pool of volunteers, how will the rivalry between the Russian army and the Wagner troops turn out? It is not possible to predict this from now, but the rivalry between the two reveals a fact. This fact is Russia's defeats and losses during the war. On the other hand, signs of an imminent counterattack by Ukraine are mounting, with escalating military offensive by both sides. Russian forces taking defensive positions, and even an unexplained explosion derailing a supply train on the Russian border. Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, reported that the army had come to the finish line in preparations to launch a counterattack, and they had decided how, where, and when the counterattack would take place. Russia is building some of the most comprehensive military defense systems seen anywhere in the world in decades, the UK's Defense Intelligence Agency said in a statement. It seems that the Ukrainian forces are prepared to launch a counterattack at any moment. Aware of this situation, the Russian army is in a defensive mode, considering the failures on the front lines, including Bakhmut. It is a matter of curiosity how Russia will react to the counterattack. With the warming of the weather and the drying of the ground completely, the front lines of Ukraine will become quite active. We will wait and see what will happen in this relentless war between Russia and Ukraine in the coming days. The Ukrainian army continues to make a name for itself with its successful offensive operations. With the end of the harsh winter season, the severity of the Ukrainian war increased. The armies of the two countries are now able to conduct ground operations, and this is causing the war to prolong each day. But the operations carried out before the expected counterattack of Ukraine hurts the Russian army. Last week, the Ukrainian army, which besieged the Russian troops in Bakhmut and rendered the last remaining Russian supply routes unusable, struck the Russian army from an unexpected place, trying to weaken the Russian troops as much as possible for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The heroic Ukrainian soldiers blew up one of the biggest Russian bases. Come on, get your drinks ready and settle into your comfortable seats. And let's examine together the operations of the Ukrainian army against the Russians. Ukrainian artillery units blew up the largest Russian military headquarters in the Zaporizhia region located in the Russian-controlled city of Melitopol. With successful HIMARS shots, the Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, is on the subject. Residents of Melitopol heard explosions on the western part of Melitopol from the side of Lewald factory, which was captured by the Russian army and turned into the largest military base in the region. Afterwards, black smoke started to rise from the area where the factory was located, he said. The Ukrainian Army's Southern Operations Command also reported that a successful operation was carried out after the reconnaissance UAVs transferred the correct coordinates to the artillery units. The base became completely unusable, and according to the first determinations, 200 Russian soldiers were killed and wounded. The Russian Defense Ministry, however, declined to comment on the attack and claimed that the situation in Melitopol was normal. However, satellite photos taken from the region after the attack leave the claims of the Russian Defense Ministry unfounded. This offensive by the Ukrainian artillery was the largest operation on the southern front since the capture of Kherson from Russian control. Also, many Western analysts stated that the destruction of the Russian base is very important for the massive counteroffensive that the Ukrainian army is about to launch. The expected big counterattack of the Ukrainian army is almost about to begin, and the Ukrainian army is already wearing out the Russian army with very successful operations to avoid any problems during the counterattack. As an example of these successful operations, recently, the Ukrainian army attacked the port of Berdyansk. A missile was seen flying over Berdyansk, but the type of rocket could not be determined due to distance, according to local officials. Then there was a big explosion on the port side. According to preliminary assessments, 3 Russian ships moored in Berdyansk harbor were damaged. In addition, 15 ship crews were out of the war as a result of this attack. Russian officials, after initial investigations, stated that they thought the attack was carried out with the production Shadow Storm missiles. Russian officials' predictions appear to be correct, given the location where the missile was fired and the altitude at which it was launched. Information about the attack was also confirmed and officially announced by officials appointed by Russia. There were 3 attacks in total, according to officials. They all hit the city port. In addition, the Kremlin confirmed the losses in the initial determinations. The Russian-appointed manager of the city, the soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces, attacked Berdyansk around 12 o'clock yesterday. The attacks were in the port area. According to preliminary information, 3 Russian ships were damaged, one of which was heavily damaged. The 15 personnel of the heavily damaged ship died during the attack. We estimate that the target of the Ukrainian army was directly the port itself. Our emergency service teams are still working, he said. Local residents published the moment of the attack in Berdyansk. The rockets crashed into the harbor as originally claimed, judging by the photos showing a massive column of smoke and dust rising. However, until now, there is no information about the exact target of the missiles. However, it is very likely that the Russian Navy ships or the infrastructure of the Berdyansk port will become targets in the future. No official statement has yet been made about the functioning of Russian air defense systems in the region and the possible interception of Ukrainian missiles. But earlier in the week, the Russian army enforced a pause control as it entered and exited Berdyansk. The suspects were not taken into the city. This leads to the conclusion that the Russian army predicted a possible attack on Berdyansk but did not take any measures against it. So what is the purpose of Ukraine's attack on Berdyansk? Due to its location. Berdyansk is located in the middle of Melitopol and Mariupol. It is quite normal that the port, which has an important place, especially in the supply by sea, is targeted like all Russian supply routes, with a great counterattack of the Ukrainian army is approaching. In addition, this attack may have been carried out to support an attack on Mariupol and Melitopol, which are among the possible targets of the Ukrainian army. The shooting of the Navy elements in Berdyansk is of great importance for Ukraine to liberate these regions. Ukraine's anticipated counteroffensive is awaited by the Ukrainian army and Ukraine's Western partners for the massive counteroffensive. The Biden administration in particular is increasing its support for Kiev and providing additional billions of dollars in financial aid alongside more advanced weapons systems. During his recent visit to Ukraine, President Joe Biden reaffirmed the United States' unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Meanwhile, Washington has largely ignored Russia as a long-term threat to U.S. and NATO security. According to the U.S., Russia not only lost the war in Ukraine, but was so crushed by Ukraine's resistance that it will not pose a threat to NATO in the coming years. So does this view match the reality on the ground? The current U.S. debate on strategy, power structure, and acquisition programs focuses obsessively on China. Russia's war with Ukraine is seen as a one-off version of the First World War. The value of current forces and the importance of planned weapons programs are judged almost solely by their ability to sink Chinese ships. As a result, the tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery, and rockets that dominate the Russia-Ukraine conflict are underestimated. So will the forces that will be at the center of any future major ground conflict, primarily residing in the U.S. Army. The poor performance of the Russian military in the early stages of the war in Ukraine astonished almost the entire U.S. defense community, just as the Russian Air Force was unable to gain air superiority. The war also revealed problems with the Russian Army's logistics, command and control intelligence, cyber warfare, and naval operations. Still, Russia has taken control of 18% of Ukraine and continues to defend these areas against Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's successful resistance is seen in the West not only as an end in itself, but also as a means of advancing the strategic goal of weakening Russia's military too much to pose a future threat to NATO. The current attitude towards the Russian military may be, in part, a reaction to the earlier overstatement of Russian capability. US Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley had predicted at the start of the Russian offensive that Kiev would fall within 72 hours. Now the needle points in the opposite direction. Many in the Pentagon do not care about the current capabilities of the Russian military or the future threat Moscow may pose to its neighbors. To put it bluntly, Russia lost the Ukrainian war strategically, operationally, and tactically. For this reason, the Kremlin is paying a huge price by losing its future generations on the battlefield.